Today's story is about someone who finally vented all the words they wanted to say to their blood relatives, who were worse than strangers, and cut off the relationship. Let's take a look together. Please like and subscribe our channel.
I am seeking advice and writing this post. I am a woman in my early 30s, married for 4 years, and in the last month of my pregnancy. My husband, who is 5 years older than me, takes good care of me. I have a family that I don't even want to consider as such, consisting of my grandmother, father, and younger brother. My grandmother treated my mother poorly because she gave birth to a daughter. Even after my mother gave birth to my younger brother, she continued to be mistreated by my grandmother. I believe that my grandmother mistreated my mother not because she gave birth to a daughter, but because she was just a bad person. Unable to endure the mistreatment, my mother left home and divorced my father. Since then, my father has lived with various women, dating them, and so on. From middle school, I hardly ever received an allowance. I saved the money that relatives gave me during holidays, or when I occasionally met them, and bought school supplies with it. On the other hand, my grandmother secretly gave my younger brother an allowance, because he was a son. I didn't know when I was young, but as an adult, I realized that my father didn't care about anyone else but himself, because my grandmother pampered him. He couldn't even see his own children, and his life, his relationships, and his drinking money were more important. I don't want to call him my father because he was so indifferent. When I was in middle school, I found out that he had given tens of thousands of won as an allowance to the daughter of a woman he was dating. At that time, I had just started my period. But he didn't even give me money to buy sanitary pads. This is just one example of his indifference. If I list all of them, it would be too long, but anyway. I grew up experiencing a lot of discrimination. Since high school, I started saving money by working part-time jobs, and started working right after graduating from high school. I was eager to escape from home as soon as possible, so I saved up money. I moved out of my parents' house and lived alone, and in my early 20s, I met my current husband and got married after a long relationship. When we were getting married, my in-laws said they would support us with about 100 million won. But I felt sorry for my husband and decided to get married with the money we had saved. I knew that my family didn't have the money to support us, but they didn't even have the intention to do so. My father talked about having a formal meeting between the two families, but I was afraid he would say something strange, so we didn't have one and just had a wedding. We didn't give any bridal gifts to our in-laws, but my aunts asked for handbooks and quilts, clinging to us like beggars. I told them not to come to my wedding because we were going to get married without exchanging anything. But they came to the wedding grumbling. In the end, we received 3 times the amount of congratulatory money from my husband's family than from my family. I wanted to get away from my family after getting married, and I was so happy to live in the countryside where my husband's job was. I went to my family's house once a year, and only kept in touch out of obligation. As I mentioned earlier, I am now in the last month of my pregnancy. My in-laws, including my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, are very excited about the first grandchild and nephew in their family, and they are even fighting over who will pay for the postnatal care center and hospital expenses. However, my grandmother and father said they have no interest because it's the child of a daughter who has married out. After getting married, I tried hard to understand my grandmother and father. I thought I could forgive everything because they had neglected me in the past, and I was receiving a lot of love from my husband and in-laws after marriage. However, when I heard them speak, as if they were neglecting even the child in my womb, I thought I could never forgive them. A problem erupted recently. My father, who I rarely spoke to, called me and asked for money because he had broken up with the woman he was living with and needed to move, knowing that there would be many expenses when the baby is born. I told him I didn't have any money and hung up. For several days, my father kept calling and asking for money. He asked for money to change his car, and when I refused, he asked for an allowance. I refused all his requests. Then, he eventually called my husband and asked for money. My husband told me he said he would think about it and hung up the phone, which made me very angry. I was angry at my husband for even considering giving money to my father, knowing how I had lived. My husband, who is always kind, apologized and seemed to be aware of my feelings. I was so angry at my father and felt so sorry to my husband that I cried and apologized to my husband for getting angry with him. The thought that came to me then was that I couldn't forgive my father, who raised me like someone else's child, and is now asking me for money, and even taking advantage of my husband's pure and kind heart to ask him for money. I should not do this for the sake of my unborn child. But my anger towards my grandmother and father does not subside, and I am having a hard time. Then, I received a call from my grandmother. She called me a terrible person, saying that my father had told her what had happened. She said, "Your father was left alone at a young age, and even when I told him to send you to an orphanage, he didn't abandon you and even got you married. Don't you know his favor?" She said this while interjecting very harsh words. I also spoke sarcastically to my grandmother. "You should have sent me to an orphanage. It would have been better to grow up in an orphanage than to grow up in our house, without receiving an allowance once and being discriminated against. How can you say that you did well for my father when you tormented my mother and left him alone? You are the one who raised my father to be a man who still can't get his act together, and is only thinking about dating women. If my grandfather hadn't passed away early, he would have kicked out my crazy grandmother, and my mother wouldn't have left home." I spoke harshly like this. My grandmother said until the end that I was a woman who didn't know the favor of raising her. I was so angry, I ended up saying, "My in-laws, brother-in-law, and sister-in-law are the ones who think about what they can do for the baby. So I am really happy living with them. They are my family, not my grandmother and father. They are completely different from my grandmother, who drove her daughter-in-law away with her nasty temper and made her son and grandchildren pitiful. My in-laws are delighted to have a daughter-in-law like me in their family. In our family, a woman like my grandmother came in and ruined everything. I'm happily married, so my grandmother should live her life in atonement for ruining my father's life. We're no longer family, so don't contact me. I'm worried about my younger brother, who lives with my grandmother, but I'll just live happily on my own." And hung up the phone. I thought, what would change if I said everything I wanted to say to my hated grandmother and father? They're still family. But after saying that to my grandmother and hanging up, I felt so relieved. Since then, I have not answered any calls from my grandmother and father, and have blocked their numbers. I used to resent my mother for leaving home, leaving me and my younger brother behind, but I began to understand a little. My aunts also called me and messaged me, saying that I was an ungrateful person because I didn't answer their calls. I responded by saying, "Why are you contacting me now, when you pretended not to know how hard it was for me growing up and asked for this, and that when I got married, find my mother, who left home because you tormented her, and live in filial piety? To be honest, I have no intention of finding my mother. I still resent her. I thought I might feel depressed if I cut ties with my family. But I don't feel depressed, I just feel relieved. Am I the bad one? Could I regret what I've done later? I'm curious about how others with similar experiences have fared. I would appreciate advice and comfort from many people. I want to tell everything to my in-laws, but they are such good people that I can't bring myself to worry them. Thank you for reading.
She really grew up well, even in such a harsh environment. She hasn't done anything wrong. I think she should keep going as she thinks. What do you all think?